Hello and welcome to Fearless Authenticity with me, Jeanne Sparrow. This is my podcast, which is about finding our success in the gift of who we truly are. Now, this podcast is mainly conversations with people who know what that looks like and feels like, in the hope that they and their stories will be an inspiration to you to find ways to use your unique gifts in pursuing your passions, making your dreams come true, and serving the world in the way you were created to do so. Now, I want this to be deep because that's where we find the good stuff. You got a mind for it, but don't get it twisted. It is about fun too, because if it ain't fun, it ain't worth doing. So let's dare to be brave, be free, be you together. Now, my guest today is the author of 3 books on American women's politics and power. She's a speaker, nationally respected strategist on women's leadership, an experienced media analyst, and a past faculty member of the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. She is a founding director of one of the nation's first women's centers, a founding commissioner of the Illinois Human Rights Commission, and has been advisor to many history makers, including Chicago's first African-American mayor, Harold Washington, Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Geraldine Ferraro, the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, the Ms. Foundation for Women, and so many others. She is listed among feminists who changed America, and I am honored and pleased to welcome Rebecca Sive to the Fearless Authenticity podcast. Hi, Rebecca.
Well, hi, it's a thrill to be here. And after that intro, I think I should run for cover somewhere.
Do it, girl. Don't run for cover. Run for office somewhere. Help us run for it. I don't tell any lies in my introductions, but I do believe in giving people flowers when they are here. It is an honor to talk to you, to see you. It is hard to know where to even start, though, to be honest, with your body of work and the things you have done. The place that I've decided to land for our starting point, it is clear that you have either found yourself and or put yourself in places where you could move the needle on who gets a say in what our world looks like, shifting the concept about who can lead, who can even run. When did you know that this was the work for you? Did you seek it out or did it find you?
What a great question. Well, just a bit of family background that I think is relevant. My parents were very involved in politics and community issues, and so I saw firsthand what that was about. And when I was 8 years old, my father ran for office. He ran for Congress. He was a young man at the time. It was a very Republican district. He was the Democratic candidate. And I was the oldest of 5 kids. He took me with him on some of the little, knocking on doors and going to amusement parks and shaking hands and stuff. And so I think by the time I was a young teenager, I was continuing to accompany my father in particular in his public work. And so I had a feel for liking it. Obviously, if I didn't, I would have done something else. And I was doing other things, but that was important to me. And by the time I was in high school, I believe I knew that I really cared about public issues and government. That's how I described it at that time. And when I went to college, I was part of that generation that after the civil rights movement, a little bit into when the women's movement was starting up, student organizing on campuses because of the Vietnam War. And so, there was really a moment then, there have been other moments in time, but certainly that was one where those of us who cared about these issues of justice and equality and civil rights and so on were able to find a way to participate. And the other thing that happened, I think that sort of, made me find my particular path was, I think maybe when I was a sophomore or junior in college, a friend of mine at school gave me a copy of a book called Sisterhood is Powerful. And for those here who are listening, who may not have heard about this book, it was published a long time ago. it's a compilation of essays by, early feminists, basically, and civil rights activists. And the notion of sisterhood, I don't think I'd ever heard that word, right? The notion of power, I did know from my parents, but that, I read that, I thought about it, I met with my girlfriends, and I was off.
I want to dig deeper into the word sisterhood, and especially when I look at the different kinds of work that you do, and especially as a feminist. Your work seems to have the intersectionality that we are trying to go for these days,
Yes.
that has been a challenge in the past. What is it that made you choose that path? Because it could not have been necessarily easy to be inclusive when people get so focused on one particular issue. And because your work seems to go back and forth, even though those issues between civil rights and women's rights should not be necessarily separate, they often are, because people do drill down into one thing. What is it about that sort of intersectionality that appeals to you? And have you had to make choices between them as you've moved along your path, or moments where you've been, you know what, I'm going to have to shift away from this because this isn't right for me and doesn't speak to my ethos?
I would say there's never been a moment, in all seriousness, when these were not joined for me. The notion of civil rights, particularly for African Americans in the U.S., and women's rights here as well. And I can tell you, my parents taught us that everybody was equal. I remember discussing when I was a kid at that point, Mississippi Summer, and when Viola Liuzzo was killed, and that was a big story. And I asked my mother, well, why aren't you down there, And that's the kind of environment I grew up in. And she said, well, I have 5 kids. I'm trying to do what I can here, which she did. And so, we just grew up with that. It's also probably relevant that my mother is an immigrant, that she and her parents were able to come here because of people who believed in freedom of everybody, equality for everybody. This was in 1941, when the U.S. was just entering World War II. So I guess I would say I grew up with the notion that, the Declaration of Independence should be really true for everybody. All people are created equal. And so I would say that when my husband and I moved to Chicago after college, in part we moved here because particularly I had been in school here for a while, but and had a lot of political experience at that time. It was during Black Panthers, the Young Lords in Chicago, and the program I was in was focused on urban issues. So I really had an opportunity to meet a lot of people across the city at a young age, now 50 years ago. And at the same time, my husband, who loved the blues, and this is relevant to answering your question, began working for one of the local blues and jazz labels, and over the next decade produced some spectacular records by various famous Chicago bluesmen. And so we spent lots of time in blues clubs, but also lots of time with the families of the people, with whom Steve was working. And so we developed, I guess I would say, an intimate understanding, on a personal level, of the importance of, what you termed intersectionality. We have to be for all. And I guess the last thing I would say is I was so fortunate that I guess in 1980, I met Harold Washington, and he was a state senator at the time. As you know, he was the Democratic sponsor of the Illinois Human Rights Act, which was a historic moment. And Governor Thompson appointed me to the commission, and I was a kid, but I had been active. I had done a lot already, and I went to see Harold at his office on South Cottage Grove. For those of you who may not be from Chicago, it's a wonderful place to be on the South Side. And Harold, in his own inimitable way, said, "You're my person, Rebecca. You're my person." And oh my God, what a sense of responsibility. He was on his way to Congress at that point. And then, so I was both fortunate and sought out the opportunities to work across borders, so to speak. And I don't see any other way of doing or being. I would just say one other thing that's related to that, because these are, speaking of sisterhood, in the mid 1970s, when Illinois was considering ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, Addie Wyatt and Willie Barrow, two amazing women leaders, nationwide, worldwide, certainly here in Chicago, were proponents of the ERA, and I, as a young organizer, met them. And, we remained friends. We worked together really until they passed. And so, contrary to what some may think, this was in the mid 70s. There are some of us who've been working specifically together across racial lines for a very long time. There aren't, of course, challenges, but the joy way outweighs the challenges, as do the accomplishments.
It is interesting to hear personal histories, right? Like we can hear about how things came to be from the perspective of a larger picture, and I think sometimes we need those perspectives. But right. It's always the personal histories for me. And that's what I like about your most recent book, Make Her Story Your Story, this guided journal. It came out last year, kind of out of what happened in the pandemic, using journaling as a tool for discovery. So talk to me about what you want people to do with this journal. It's based around these 3 directives: imagine, create, and organize. But how does that help us tell our individual stories, and why is that individual story so important to the work that we do, whatever work that ends up being?
To start with the individual story, the book and my other work, and I know yours too, is premised on, to paraphrase Reverend Jackson, everybody is somebody, and every person, every woman has the power within herself, the intelligence, the fortitude, the grit, to be somebody, to contribute to the common good, and to achieve for herself. And so the notion is that with Make Her Story Your Story, that once you identify your story, once you imagine it, right, then you can go about the business of creating it, of organizing it, of doing it. And so I think that, the idea here is to provide a tool for women to sort of sit down and in a systematic way identify what it is they want to do in the public arena. There are other journals that help each of us, identify issues that are more personal or perhaps professional or familial, right? But this is about, gee whiz, I really want to do some things in my neighborhood and I haven't gotten around to them yet. How am I going to do them, right? So I'm going to imagine what they are. I'm going to go about using this journal to put that down. And the implication there as well, I would say, is that part of the process, of course, of doing this is none of us can do any of this alone, right? So when you identify based on your own story, your own talents, your own interests, your own commitments, when you identify what it is you're going to do specifically, you're then going to have to corral all your friends and reach out to people you may not know. And so in that way, you build not only an individual, her story, but our story, right? Our story as women of what we're doing, what we're doing together. And, that to me that's it. That's what I want to help people do.
And that gets to the core of sisterhood, because I think a lot of times we think about our sisterhood as friendship, right? Which is part of it. But then there's this other sort of resource group that may
Yeah.
have friendship as a foundation, but it's also something that helps us all get ahead together. And you talk a lot about that in Every Day is Election Day,
Right.
and the things that we learn. What is it? Because the other thing I find interesting about that is that your work is based toward public life, but
Right.
these strategies could work for anybody who's doing anything. What do you
That's right.
think what is at leadership in any sphere of influence? What does it mean to have our own sense of strength, this building this sisterhood? What are some things to get us there? What are those essential things that any of us can do that can get us to that point? Because we often have challenges with that.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned Every Day is Election Day. For those here who hope you take a look at it, it's a guidebook for women running for office, but it really is a guidebook useful for achieving leadership in any public sphere, whether it's business or politics or academia. And it interweaves a set of lessons from women I interviewed, as well as sharing some of my own experience. And what I would say about the steps to doing that, to that leadership. I know you know this, as well, and have written about it and talked about it, obviously. But I would say, as you have said, that in the first place, it's knowing one's own story, right? Knowing one's own, and that isn't the sort of litany of I went to this school or that school. It's who am I, right? Who am I? And therefore, what can I then take from who I am to then build this career, whatever this career is? And for me, I would say, I start with discipline and grit. I really do. I think that one of the things, again, go back to my parents, the discipline and grit that they expressed. And my mother would make a joke about, we grew up in New York, and she would, if we did something, she said, well, that and a token will get you in the subway.
Oh my goodness.
Don't get too big for your britches, right? Another old timey expression. And, it was sort of like, yeah, you might be smart. We think you're smart. You probably, you are talented, but you're going to work hard and you're going to be disciplined and you're going to stick at it, stick with it when you're not doing so well. And you're not going to, and while you are somebody, as we were discussing a minute ago, you're not superior to anybody. You're not better than anybody, right? So the notion of we're all equal, and individually to get to the place where we're all equal in a better place is grit, discipline. I also would add to that, I think willing to do your homework about what the how to get the work done. It's not an easy thing, whether it's in business or in politics or government, to figure out what the right sort of agenda items are, right? What the right policies are. And so you really do have to study. You really do have to talk to other people. You have to read. You have to, keep up with things. And so I think that's really important. Another thing that I think has held me in good stead is I really do believe that more heads are better than one, and so I think that while we each contribute and want to be recognized for that, the collective contribution is going to be greater, right, and more significant. And that's how it needs to be, because I think that if you show collective achievement, you then show younger people or other people who may not be involved in what you're doing, this can happen, if we come together. those are sort of the biggies to me in terms of what the steps are. I guess the only other thing I would add, since I know this was a question you asked me to think about, there's going to be failures, right?
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. I want to dig
Yeah.
a little bit deeper. We're gonna come back to the failures piece, but one of the things I want to dig deeper in, when you talk about who I am and what I have to offer, to me, that conveys a sense of value, right? This idea that knowing ourselves is also knowing what, not only the things that we have important for ourselves, but also what we bring to other people just by the fact that we're there, what happens when we come together as a community, or what we bring to people as a service. And one of the things that I'm going to take a quote from one of your writings: every story has value, every woman has value and can make her valuable contribution. And having a dream that's really important to you so that your brand, your message is about that dream. The problem happens, I think, for a lot of people, or the challenge happens in discovering what that is. So what is your tried and true method or happenstance method of gaining an understanding of what that value is and what we bring to other people to be able to walk in that power? Because I think it does change when you walk in a room and you know what you know, and you're like, this is what I came to do with you and for you.
Right. I think in terms of figuring out what my value, what one's individual value proposition is, so to speak, I guess maybe because I'm a writer and a speaker and an organizer, I tend to write things down and be willing to sort of, I might not be willing to share it all, but for me, and to sort of stare it in the face. And I think that I actually, this is really a toughie, because I think to some extent, once you sort of put your value proposition out there in some sort of public arena, right? So in my case, fairly early on, I started talking to my college girlfriends about, some work we wanted to do to make some changes on campus. Once you put your value proposition out there, in that case, I was saying I'm a good organizer and I know these issues and we can, these women's issues, and we can do something about them. People then will put you in a place, not to say a box, right? So I would say that it's critical to figure out that initial value proposition. But I've found, in one of the errors that I have made in the course of my own work, is knowing that I had other attributes, but I was afraid to express them. Because, it was like, this is too scary, and maybe people won't believe I really know this. And so I would not pursue something I thought I could do.
When did you get over that? Because clearly, Rebecca, you have expanded your territory when it comes to the things that apply. How did you get over that fear of expressing these other things that you're good at and actually doing them?
I probably didn't totally. I think that I think that a friend of mine who, when I started doing my own consulting work, this was like 30 years ago or something, when I was talking to various people I know who are successful business people and kind of trying to learn from them about what they did and how they did it. And one of my friends said, Rebecca, I said, I want to do this, and this, like, I know. And he said, I want you to lean in, we use that term, with what, shoulder in, kind of what he said, with what your strengths are. And so I think that in that context, I was able, for instance, to pursue some things because I just really felt, yes, I know this. I want to do this. So, for instance, I wanted to be considered not only as an organizer and an advocate, but as a strategist and thinker, right? And so that was a gradual process. But in the process of organizing, if you're doing it well, you're strategizing, right? In the process of leading well, you're thinking about what's next. You're thinking about policy, right? In the case of public work, like what I've done. So, but I think all of us have, I'm guessing, but I think a lot of us probably all through life, go through with, that one's making me a little nervous, right?
Yeah, I think we do get hesitant. And I wonder if also that is a particularly female phenomenon, right? One of the things, you have a video on your website that says we can learn while we're running, learn while we're doing. We don't have to be timid about it. But there is, I think, this feeling sometimes that we need validation, we need credentials, maybe even permission to do what we want to do. And I think that's some of what you're talking about. So then the question becomes, how do we learn while we run, or give ourselves permission? Is that something we do for each other? Is it something we do for ourselves? I'm asking you some hard questions today, aren't I?
No, I actually need to think about that a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to think about that a little more.
We can come back to that. We can come back to that, because, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in the context of this fear of success idea, that something that was very helpful to me in sort of realizing I need to get past this fear. And this is also something that was published a long time ago, but it's kind of eternal truths. There was a early woman professor at Harvard University named Martina Horner, and she published an article, I think this was in the 70s, may have been while I was in graduate school, called, it's called Fear of Success Among Women. And she talked about, and you probably have seen it or read about it, she talked about that it was true even among, women who had been successful, that there was this fear, and I remember reading it. I remember thinking about it. I also knew at the time, that, there were goals that I and my sisters of my generation had that were not achieved by women of earlier generations, right? And that in order to get there, we had to not fear success and what we needed to do to be successful, which was assertive. And so sometimes I feel like I still need to say that to younger women I'm mentoring, but I also then remind them of some of the amazing progress, not putting aside the difficult circumstances we're presently facing, but the amazing progress of women as of 2023. They're just, my girlfriend from way back in the day, Robin Gable, is now the majority leader of the Illinois House of Representatives, right? My girlfriend Barbara Curry preceded her. If you had asked, there was some press about her I saw this morning, which made me think about it. When Robin first decided to run for state rep, which was, 12 years ago or something like that, she came to see me. We talked about it. How are we going to do this? Who do we need to, get in the mix? Do I need to straighten my hair? I'm going from, but seriously. And here we are. And she's, one of the few people running that show in a big state, and so that's just an example, right, of something that whatever fears Robin had, she just pushed past them. And so I think I think we just need to say that out loud and remember there's evidence of it.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, there's so many things to be afraid of in this world, and there's so many things that we forget about the good things sometimes. And I like that you take these moments to assess those. It reminds me of something that Dr. Anita Hill said. She said that this is a relay race when it comes to equity and equality, that, you know, there have been foundations that were set before us, right? But all of the work wasn't done. So foundational work was done. And then, you know, the next generation takes it and then passes the ball on to the next generation to complete and push it forward. How do you see the progress that we've made, both in civil rights, in women's rights, especially with the cha-cha dance, as I like to call it, that I feel like we're doing now, where sometimes you take a couple steps forward, you feel like you take a giant step back, especially when, you know, things are so much more present now when it comes to the news because of social media. We are much more aware of grievances that we have, of injustices that are out there, which is a good thing. It also makes us feel like we're not making progress. How do you hold on, especially as a strategist and an organizer? How do you hold on to the progress to motivate you to move forward?
I think in the first place, I'm a pretty visual person. I like to look at pictures of women doing fabulous things, you know? And I mean, I'm like, oh, I see the women senators standing up there and giving speeches, or I watch it on CNN, or, you know, something like that. Or I see girlfriends in Chicago, you know, doing their thing, you know, and there they are in the newspaper, or in photos we took at a party or something like that. I think it's really important to capture the visuals of this success and to hold those in your mind. I also think it's important to have, and we touched on this before, this sort of arc of history of justice sense of things, right? I mean, that while there is as profound systemic racism and sexism in our country as almost ever, as we've seen in the last week, there has been forward movement over time. And if you're educated enough to know that, and sometimes people are not, you can then feel, I think, good about what we've been able to do and have some fortitude in the face of, well, here's the next awful thing that's happened and I want to act on it. The other thing, I guess, to me is talking to older women. I had, a woman friend of mine, she's in her mid-80s, and she basically was a housewife and, you know, worked outside the home from time to time, but not a lot. And she expressed some considerable disappointment the other day to me about some work she's trying to do in her mid-80s. And I just said, well, let's talk about it. You know, let's remember, right? And so I think we have a responsibility to our elders, so to speak, to not give up and to know their stories. I actually, this is sad, but not. My mother died a couple months ago at the age of 99. And, well, it's not, 99 is a wonderful life.
That's a blessing.
It's a blessing. But in the course of it, I and my siblings, we uncovered some things about her we hadn't known before. And, you know, so to that point about treasuring the stories of our elders and realizing. So my mother was the first president of the school board in the suburban, woman's president of the suburban school board, where we all went to school. Mind you, this is 1972. Right. And then we found one of my brothers found some newspaper stories about her going to, well, this is in New York, so she went to Albany. Here it would have been Springfield, right? To lobby for more money for the schools, you know. And I'm just like looking at this, and it's 1972, and there was actually a photo. in the local community paper of my mother, kind of going like this to some local state senator guy, And I just thought, well, if she could do that then, right? In all seriousness, if Addie Wyatt could go from very humble circumstances in Brookhaven, Mississippi, to being an international leader of a union and whispering in the ears of, advice of presidents and mayors, we cannot sit down and give up. We just can't.
I love the continuity of all of that. My work has made me enamored, and my family has made me enamored of stories, but it's so interesting how stories hold so much power, not only in us absorbing and holding the powers for our elders, but also reflecting that back to them and then passing it on. Like there's a continuity that you're talking about here that that I don't even know, like, the layers, but then you don't know the layers sometimes, right? I want to go back to failure for a second, because as business owners, as people who are trying to get anything done, you're always going to have these failures, right? These things. And I'm sure you've had your challenges and the times that you've had setbacks. Thinking about some of the more disappointing or heartbreaking setbacks, what have they taught you about this concept of failing forward, using those failures to turn them eventually into a success? Do you have some sort of system to keep moving forward when you are challenged in that way or have a setback?
Actually, I do. When I fail, I try to figure out, so to speak, what were the elements of the failure? Was it timing? Was it resources? Was it a failure to build a coalition or a network that was needed? Was it my own stubbornness? I'm a stubborn person. To figure out what the elements were, and then to decide, and then to think about, well, if I try to do something like this again, or I try this again, right? How do I factor in success on those elements? So I had a difficult time with something I was doing. It was last year. And I actually, on Saturday night, I was sitting at home crying over at the dinner table. I was so upset. And then I just decided, I was trying to do something with this person and it wasn't working. And I just called a girlfriend of mine who knows this person also. And she and I have been friends since the 70s. And I said, can I talk this through with you? Like, I know it's Saturday night, and if you don't want to talk to me on Saturday night, that's fine. And of course, she said, no, and we talked. And what she said to me, this is a good example it was for me of sort of isolating the elements. She said to me, you do have to step back. And you have to step back, you have to listen and absorb and be quiet in a way that even where you think this is unfair, you're going to do it. And try to glean everything you possibly can, that was the second piece, from what you're listening to and not responding to. Wow. Right. That was, I will tell you, that was my most recent experience of, and hard for me to do. Hard, I'm like, no, that's wrong. Listen to me, that kind of thing. And she's that kind of person too. And so, of course, it meant a lot. It meant even more, coming from her. And so I did what she recommended. I got through it. And so I think, the lesson there for me was being willing to isolate the elements. If it had to do with my own action, to the extent that something was still salvageable, out of the failure, let me find that. Sometimes there isn't, I mean, I can tell you another great story from Harold Washington, which people might appreciate. When I
Oh
was
yeah.
asked, which relates to the failure thing. This is like my favorite story. When Harold, I was on the Human Rights Commission, and so I knew him and all that, and I was asked by his campaign manager to join the campaign in a leadership role. This is 1982 in his historic campaign. And I said, of course, but you know me, I got to talk to Harold too. So I went down. Harold lived in Hyde Park, as you know, and there was this little kind of coffee shop across the street from his building. So we went in the coffee shop, and it was like 7:00 at night. We each ordered a Diet Coke, and it had a little napkin underneath the glass of soda pop. So we're talking, and I'm leaning in, and I'm saying, I'm honored to be asked, which I was. I'm going to work as hard as I can, which I did. And then I said to him, this is a man who had his share of losses. I said, but I don't really care whether you win or not, because you stand for what I believe in and what's right. And Harold looked at me across this little table, under his bushy eyebrows. He said, Rebecca, and he took the cocktail napkin. And this is the lesson about identifying the elements. He took the cocktail napkin. He started listing out, the wards by number, the 5th ward, the 6th ward, the 7th ward, the 8th ward. And he said, Rebecca, if I get 90%, and these were all predominantly African-American wards. He said, if I get, 90% plus in these wards, I will be the next mayor. It won't matter what white people do.
Harold
was the man, as lots of people say. But I mean, the point there was he had analyzed the thing upside down and sideways, right? He knew what he needed to do. He knew where failure would come. And he was prepared. And if he'd ended up, I think he would have been disappointed had he not won, obviously, but he loved being in Congress. So, but the point there was that preparation, that looking at it, that understanding of where failure might occur, and to work as hard as you can to prevent it, right? And to not waste your time on doing other things that don't really lead to success. That was the further implication, right?
Ma'am, you said a word right there. That is, and that applies to everything. If you just take a moment to look at all of the different things that could go wrong or that need to go right, wow, I love that. I love that so much, because I do think we have blinders, right? A lot of times where we don't see those things. And sometimes it takes a failure from the past. And I'm sure Harold had his where he knew where those gaps were that allowed him to be able to apply it. But so often we're scared to look at the failures that we miss those things. Well, damn, Rebecca.
Isn't that? Yeah. I'm like, whenever I'm like, I'm remembering what Harold taught me. And
now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's it.
That I need to sit with that for a minute. And because here's the other piece of that. Sometimes looking back at those failures is painful to see the things that maybe you've failed at before, that had you looked at them, you wouldn't have made the second failure, right?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And in this little bit of history, he had run in, for instance, as a case in point, he had run in 1977. And among other things, the failure, I think he would say this, were he alive to say it, was to not ask, for instance, the Black business community leadership to come out and force with their money, right, and time and materials to help. And therefore, when he did this analysis 4 years later, he wasn't forgetting that. He knew he had to go to them, and then he could deliver these votes. He'd have enough pamphlets to hand out, or we'd have enough pamphlets the handout.
Man.
So yeah, you're right. You got to look back at what happened, and you got to isolate what's there. And then sometimes, I guess I would also say, sometimes I don't want to do that again. I mean,
That's an
one
option.
can decide. I mean, I did it. Maybe I made some mistakes. Maybe they were small. Maybe they were bigger than I'd like to admit. But you know what? In the bigger scheme of things, I don't want to do it again, and that's okay.
My therapist said this to me recently. It's interesting you bring it up. She said to me, "You've learned that lesson. You don't need to have another iteration of it if you don't choose to." She was like, "This is a lesson you know. You know how this ends. You may not know how this particular thing plays out, but you've learned this lesson. Why do you have to keep relearning it?"
Yeah, she's onto something there for sure.
Right? Don't you hate it when they're right sometimes? Well, I want to shift just a little bit, because in that essence, even though you were working on Harold's campaign, he had a very clear idea of how things should go, it sounds like. Your work, however, is quite literally as an advisor. You have seen a lot of people get amazing success in, you knew Michelle Obama when she was earlier in her career. You've advised Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. You've worked with, the Shrivers and the Kennedy, all these different and unnamed, I'm sure, senators and Congress people, and so on and so forth. You've given amazing advice, clearly. What is the best piece of advice you have received?
I guess because the best piece of advice I would say is to persist in what I believe I want to try to get done. To be persistent. While understanding, I guess, what the contingencies are. That doesn't sound very glamorous, but I think that when you're doing public work in particular, the change is slow. And sometimes, and you have to know that, public officials aren't going to, make the trains run on time overnight, if they ever can make them run on time, So, I mean, so the idea, and this is, I remember people saying, well, when Harold gets elected, the CTA is going to be great, and garbage collection is going to be great, and this and that, and the schools, all the problems will be, well, no, or when Barack Obama was elected, people certainly believe that kind of, well, no, governing is tough, creating policies is laborious. So what do you need to have when you're doing this public work? I think is this sense of, I am going to persist. And if there's detours along the way or failures along the way, I'm going to find a way to keep persisting. And I would just say, in the current climate, something I had occasion to say recently was, sometimes the national stuff, if you're like working on women's health care, say, it's a pretty grim situation. But what can you do in your own community? Volunteer at a clinic, right? Help raise money for, not-for-profit healthcare services. I mean, there's a million things you can do on that issue in your local community. So sometimes I think the persistence is also embodies a slight shift in focus, but while still doing meaningful work. So I'm a big fan of that.
I am too, because to also paraphrase Reverend Jackson, I think that persistence and those little wins is what keeps your hope alive. And then that feeds the rest of your persistence, because I think it's very easy to look at a global situation and go, this is never going to get fixed. There, young Black men keep getting killed by police officers. That's never going to change. Oh my gosh, we lost, abortion rights in 13 states. What is that going to mean for women's health global? And I think it's very easy to get lost in the largeness of these issues.
Yes, that's right.
And forget about, and you just reminded us of those smaller little wins that can keep us going, that can build back into a big win, whatever that means for people.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yes, I think that's really important. I'm glad you emphasized that.
Yeah. I want to ask you now, as we draw to a close, what of all the things that you have done thus far, what are you proudest of as an achievement? And what do you still dream of doing?
Oh my God. Whew. I would say I'm proudest of, I came to Chicago as a student in 1971. It's now 2023. I guess I'm proudest of the fact that I stuck with what I cared about. And that in many instances has meant sticking with the people I care about. And I think that's, I cared about this then, I care about it now. I've stuck with the program that I identified for myself, with all the little, side detours or failures or whatever, or successes along the way. And so, I was telling you, I was mentioning the story about, Rob and Gable earlier. That's a good example. I mean, we've known each other a very long time, but there are dozens of people like that and issues that we've worked on together. So I'm proudest of doing that. I think I would say I'm keeping with them. In terms of what I'd like to do, I think that I love to help younger women succeed and in this work. And I get enormous joy from it, personal joy. And so I've had the good fortune of, getting to know a number of younger women and helping them, not as a career thing, but as a, big sister thing. And I love that. And I want to keep doing that. And, I want to keep doing that as long as I've got a brain in my head, I would say. And that goes to, and that's also why I've been writing, because the writing is a way to help them as well. So yeah, that I would say, I love looking at them succeed. It's just great.
I can see it on your face. Like, you shine and light up when you talk about other people's successes. And that is in and of itself just beautiful to see. So my last question that I always ask every single guest that I have: when do you, Rebecca, feel that you are at your best, truest, most authentic expression of you? When, or what are you doing? How?
Yeah. I think probably it relates to what I just said. It's being with a group of women, working on something, discussing something we care about, trying to figure out what to do. I would say that. I've been married for 50 years to my high school boyfriend. So that's a part of, there's both. So that's, for sure, when I'm with Steve, that's my authentic self as well. And I feel very fortunate that that's the case.
I love all of that. I love all of that. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing and answering probing questions. that I'm sure you're probably more used to asking than answering.
Yeah, well, yeah,
I love it.
but
Thank you.
yeah, I'm glad you're doing this. So thank you.
I love that conversation so much. The stories about Mayor Washington and, realizing how what he achieved was so purposeful and still so relevant in Chicago, especially as we lead up to this runoff election, but also to other big cities and for the culture, no matter what it is you're fighting for. But most of all, my conversation with Rebecca reinforced for me this power in knowing our stories, how that creates vision and a path for success, and how the continuity of progress is this relay race, a collective relay race that we build on what has happened or has been done before and continue that work both for ourselves and our communities. A couple of really important elements for me, how everybody is somebody who has power within themselves, this intelligence, this fortitude, this grit, to be somebody who can contribute to the common good. I think a lot of times we don't think about the impact or don't believe we can have impact as we achieve for ourselves, and that she has a process from her book, Make Her Story, Our Story, identifying that story and imagining it, then going about the business of creating what you've imagined, organizing it, and then actually doing it. I think it makes it feel so much more possible when you have a process to do stuff. And then the collective part that I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think a lot of times we feel like, or maybe even feel bad that we can't do something alone. But it's not supposed to be that way. Somehow we've bought into a narrative that isn't actually true, that we can build our individual stories together, that this collective contribution will always be greater. I mean, we always have heard more heads, two heads are better than one, and more heads make it even better when we're able to do something great and significant and pool our resources and then show other people that it is possible, because sometimes we even doubt that any progress is possible because we get so down on things. And then I like how she's not afraid to look at failure, dissect it, and learn from it. I think so many times, I know this has been true for me, and I can't be alone in this, that we want to shy away from looking at what happened and just move forward, right? But when we can see it, and here's another process, isolating these, figuring out these elements of what happened, stepping back, listening, absorbing, gleaning everything we can from our failures or our shortcomings, and then figuring out how to find the success if and when we try again. Because then there's also that element, okay, is this something I want to do again? Is that lesson something I can apply to something else? And then the idea of capturing the visuals of our successes or success in general and being able to look at that closely. A lot of times we don't celebrate our wins in an intentional way. So all of that I'm going to take with me. I'm not good at creating processes, but I'm good at following them. So when somebody can create one with me or for me, I absolutely love it. So thank you for that, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing your journey and your stories and helping us to see how our stories can make a difference, not only in our lives, but in everybody's. I also really appreciate you, my Fearless Authenticity community. I could not do this without you. I also couldn't do it without my amazing production team. Thank you for your hard work every single week. I hope you will like, rate, review, download, subscribe, and share this episode. It is available everywhere you get your podcasts, including on YouTube. You can join my community there at Ms. Jeanne Sparrow, as well as on Facebook and TikTok. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at JM Sparrow. So please drop by to say hi, share your comments, your questions, your thoughts, and your suggestions. This has been Fearless Authenticity with Jeanne Sparrow. We'll see you again soon.